Most people think the guy who eats lunch alone, turns down the group chat, and disappears on weekends is losing. Jung thought he was winning. And after studying the psychology of crowd behavior, individuation, and what he called the shadow, Jung came to a conclusion that most men never hear: solitude isn't weakness. It's the only place where the real you survives. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why the man who chooses to be alone is often operating at a level of self-awareness and psychological control that most people in constant social noise will never reach, and you'll have a framework you can actually use starting today. The crowd steals your identity without you noticing. Jung called it the persona, the mask you wear for other people. Most men spend their entire lives optimizing the mask. The guy who laughs at jokes he doesn't find funny. Who agrees in meetings he privately disagrees with. Who texts back immediately because he's afraid of what silence means. Jung watched patients in the early 1900s who were successful, social, respected, and completely hollow inside. They'd built a perfect performance and forgotten there was a person underneath it. When you're constantly surrounded by people, you're constantly receiving feedback signals about who you should be. Your nervous system adapts. You start modulating your behavior in real time to manage their reactions. Do this long enough and you stop knowing what you actually think. The lone wolf who spends time away from that feedback loop stays in contact with his own signal. He knows what he wants because nobody else is drowning it out. Solitude forces you to face the shadow, which is where your real power is. Jung identified the shadow as the part of yourself you've buried because society, family, or fear told you it was unacceptable. Aggression, ambition, defiance. Nietzsche called it the will to power. The men who suppress this completely don't get rid of it, they just lose control of it. It leaks out sideways as passive aggression, self-sabotage, or sudden explosions that confuse everyone around them, including themselves. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations about confronting the uglier impulses directly, not to indulge them, but to know them. He ruled an empire partly because he didn't lie to himself about what he was capable of. When you're alone with no performance to maintain, the shadow surfaces. That's uncomfortable. Most people run from it back into social noise. But the man who sits with it, who examines it without flinching, learns to integrate it. He doesn't become dangerous. He becomes directed. The energy that was leaking becomes fuel. That's what Jung meant by individuation, not becoming a saint, but becoming whole. Social dependency is a hidden form of control, solitude breaks it. Machiavelli noted that the prince who needs constant validation from his court is already compromised. His decisions bend toward approval, not truth. You see this everywhere today: men who can't make a decision without polling 5 people, who feel anxious the moment they're not included in something, who measure their worth by how many people responded to their message. Epictetus, a slave who became one of the most psychologically free men in history, identified this as the core trap, placing your well-being inside things you don't control, including other people's opinions. Solitude is the training ground for internal validation. When you regularly spend time alone, not numbing out, but actually sitting with yourself, you recalibrate where your approval comes from. Over time, your emotional state stops being a function of what's happening around you and starts being a function of your own standards. That's not arrogance. That's sovereignty. And it makes you genuinely harder to manipulate, because the lever most people use, social approval and exclusion, stops working on you. The lone wolf processes reality more accurately than the crowd. Gustave Le Bon wrote in 1895 that crowds are psychologically regressive, they lower the intellectual functioning of everyone in them. People in groups become more impulsive, more emotional, more susceptible to suggestion. You felt this. The meeting that makes a bad decision everyone knew was bad but nobody said out loud. The group chat that escalates into outrage over something that, alone, you'd shrug at. Schopenhauer spent most of his life deliberately isolated and produced some of the clearest thinking in European philosophy. Not because isolation makes you smarter, but because it removes the static that distorts thinking. When you're alone, you process information through your own cognitive filters without social contagion distorting it. Fear, enthusiasm, moral panic, these spread through groups like viruses. The man who regularly steps out of the social stream and thinks quietly develops what you might call signal hygiene. His threat assessments are more accurate. His decisions are less reactive. He's not immune to emotion, but he's not controlled by borrowed emotion either. Chosen solitude builds the psychological resilience that circumstances will eventually demand. Viktor Frankl survived Auschwitz partly because he had already built an interior life that external circumstances couldn't reach. He writes in Man's Search for Meaning that the last human freedom is choosing your response to what happens to you, and that freedom lives entirely inside the self. Camus made a similar point through a different lens. The absurd man who faces an indifferent universe without flinching isn't broken by it because he was never dependent on the universe being kind. The men who fall apart when they lose a job, a relationship, or a social group were outsourcing their stability to those things. Remove the thing, the man collapses. Voluntary solitude is a stress inoculation for the involuntary kind. When you deliberately practice being alone with your thoughts, your discomfort, your boredom, you're building tolerance for internal states that most people run from. So when life removes your external supports, you don't experience freefall. You experience something closer to what you've already been training in. The lone wolf isn't antisocial. He's prepared. Here's what Jung understood that most men never get taught. First, the crowd isn't your friend, it's a constant pressure to be someone else, and the longer you comply, the less you know who you actually are. Second, solitude isn't emptiness, it's where you meet the parts of yourself you've been hiding, and integrating those parts is what makes you formidable instead of fragmented. Third, the man who can be alone without being lonely has solved the core psychological problem. He's stopped placing his stability inside things he doesn't control. That's not isolation. That's mastery. If this landed for you, if some part of this conversation felt like it was naming something you already knew but hadn't heard said directly, subscribe. We drop one of these every Tuesday and Friday. No motivational noise. Just the ideas that actually hold up under pressure.